Today, and in the next lecture, we're turning to orthodoxies of mainstream feminism, meaning views about what feminism must be like that are widely accepted. There are quite a few such orthodoxies. In previous years teaching this course, I've covered anti-essentialism, the idea that feminism must not use a theory of femaleness, womanhood, or the subjects of feminism, where females, women, or the subjects of feminism have one thing, the same thing in common. Standpoint theory, the idea that women have more or better quality knowledge than men in virtue of their different social locations. Endorsement of the slogan, the personal is political, meaning that many and maybe all apparently personal problems for women are political problems. Intersectionality, the idea that feminism must be about the multiple and intersecting further identities that women have, not just their womenness. And the two we'll cover in this lecture and the next, antipathy to white feminism and trans inclusion. One of the things the philosopher takes great delight in doing is questioning what most people simply take for granted, which is important to note because it shows that what is important about this part of the lecture series is what happens to be mainstream to feminism at this time, and not the specific topics chosen. That is, it's probably the case that in 5 or 10 years, the orthodoxies of mainstream feminism will have shifted, perhaps most likely because which type of feminism is mainstream will then have shifted. And that type of feminism will have a different set of commitments. So the inclusion of the two topics I've chosen to focus on in this course is historically specific, and it may well date quickly. But the general form of the approach I'm taking can be applied at any time. Think about what the culturally dominant form of feminism in your time takes to be obvious, what everyone agrees on, what you get into trouble for challenging. Some of what is taken to be obvious may be taken to be obvious for good reason, but some of it you might have assumed there's good reason and then be surprised at how quickly things crumble once you start pushing. And that is the kind of thing that delights the philosopher. Okay, what are we doing today? We're going to try to figure out what white feminism is, such that it makes sense to think that we should not be white feminists. In part 1, I want to consider 2 disputes from the second wave that have been popularized as revealing or establishing white feminism, and yet don't quite live up to their reputations. In part 2, I want to offer 3 different interpretations of the "don't be a white feminist" claim. And in part 3, although this will be brief, I want to say something about the relation between antipathy to white feminism and the idea that feminism should or must be intersectional. Okay, part 1, historical skirmishes. Let's start with Audre Lorde and Mary Daly. In May of 1979, the black radical feminist lesbian Audre Lorde wrote a letter to the white radical feminist lesbian Mary Daly with some criticism of Daly's most recent book, Gynecology, relating to black women and feminism. In the 1981 anthology This Bridge Called My Back, and again in Lorde's own collection of essays, Sister Outsider, in 1984, Lorde published the initially private letter as an open letter, claiming to have received no reply from Daly. As Lorde put it in Sister Outsider, the following letter was written to Mary Daly, author of Gynecology, on May 6, 1979. 4 months later, having received no reply, I open it to the community of women. Lorde's letter has been widely taught across women's studies and gender studies curricula, and is one of the texts thought to have established that there was a problem of white feminism. Let's first talk about the substance of the letter in terms of the criticisms that it made, and then let's talk about the politics of Lorde's making the letter public. The letter contained 4 criticisms. The first is that Daly wrote about goddess mythology without mentioning African mythology, or Afriketa in particular. Lorde wrote, "So I wondered, why doesn't Mary deal with Afriketa as an example? Why are her goddess images only white, Western European, Judeo-Christian?" Lorde reads the absence of African mythology in Daly's book as intentional exclusion. Well, I thought, Mary has made a conscious decision to narrow her scope and to deal only with the ecology of Western European women. The second criticism is that while Daly talks about African genital mutilation in the book, and while Lorde agrees that, as she put it, your inclusion of African genital mutilation was an important and necessary piece in any consideration of female ecology, and too little has been written about it, she also says that this made non-European women in the book into mere victims and preyers upon each other. The third criticism was that Daly quotes Lorde, but Lorde felt that it was a token quotation rather than a meaningful quotation, where her words really related in the right way to the text. Lorde wrote, "Did you hunt through my work only to find words that would legitimize your chapter on African genital mutilation in the eyes of other black women?" And the fourth is Daly's failure to talk about racism in her radical feminist book about women's subordination. Lorde put these criticisms in very strong terms. About the absence of African mythology, she wrote, "I began to feel my history and my mythic background distorted by the absence of any images of my foremothers in power. As an African American woman in white patriarchy, I'm used to having my archetypal experience distorted and trivialized, but it is terribly painful to feel it being done by a woman whose knowledge so much touches my own. What you excluded from gynecology dismissed my heritage and the heritage of all other non-European women and denied the real connections that exist between all of us. Mary, do you ever really read the work of black women? Did you ever read my words?" And finally, Mary. Mary, I ask that you be aware of how this serves the destructive forces of racism and separation between women. The assumption that the herstory and myth of white women is the legitimate and sole herstory and myth of all women to call upon for power and background, and that non-white women and our herstories are noteworthy only as decorations or examples of female victimization. Then a couple of sentences later, when patriarchy dismisses us, it encourages our murderers. When radical lesbian feminist theory dismisses us, it encourages its own demise. Lorde ends her letter by noting that the experience of racism is a difference between herself and Daly. Within the community of women, racism is a reality force in my life as it is not in yours. The oppression of women knows no ethnic nor racial boundaries, true, but that does not mean it is identical within those differences. To deal with one without even alluding to the other is to distort our commonality as well as our difference, for then beyond sisterhood is still racism. Okay, there are versions of this letter freely available online, and I'll link to it in the video description for anyone who wants to read and consider the whole letter. To generalize Lorde's 4 criticisms to what might be a complaint about white feminism from the perspective of a black feminist, rather than just a complaint about Mary Daly from the perspective of Audre Lorde, and taking some liberties to make the generalized criticisms as strong as possible, we get something like: 1. Drawing on white history alone is distorting, trivializing, and dismissive to women of color. 2. Discussing problems of women of color without also presenting women of color in positions of strength or engaging with women of color as equals expresses a racialized social hierarchy. 3. Quoting women of color without engaging in detail with their ideas or without the quote being clearly and directly relevant is tokenizing. And 4. Talking exclusively about what women have in common fails to recognize what they have as difference, and that is racist. Or a shorter version, failing to talk about racism where one has a choice of talking or not talking about racism is itself racist. Okay, so stated, even if you might disagree with me about exactly how to generalize Lorde's criticisms of Daly, we can ask 2 questions. First, are these criticisms all reasonable? Are they all things we should expect feminists not to do? And so justify the use of white feminism as a kind of epithet? And second, are there feminists actually doing these things? in particular to the degree that it might be useful to coin a term like white feminism to refer to them. I'll just say about one that what Lorde says about feeling her own history dismissed and distorted could have been said by any woman from any other country and culture. And it hardly seems fair to expect that Daly should also have made space in her book to talk about Persian women's history and Papua New Guinean women's history and Sichuan women's history, and so on. Now turning from the substance of the letter to the politics of the letter. It was not true that Daly did not reply to Lorde, and that this was then the justification for Lorde's going public with the letter. Lorde's biographer, Alexis Deveau, found Daly's letter of reply in Lorde's papers as she was completing her research for the biography. Lorde had written Daly's surname on the bottom corner of the letter, which proved that she had seen it. The letter was dated September of the same year, and in it, Daly explains the long delay in response, mainly in terms of wanting to take the time to consider it properly and not offer her first reaction. In response to the criticism about the mythology, Daly writes, "I wrote gynecology out of the insights and materials most accessible to me at the time. When I dealt with myth, I used commonly available sources to find out what were the controlling symbols behind Judeo-Christian myth in order to trace a direct line to the myths which legitimate the technological horror show." She agreed that Lorde had a point in her letter and offered to meet in New York at an upcoming conference, which the two apparently did, and which apparently did not go particularly well. One of the websites telling this story that comes up early in search results now contains a disclaimer at the top, saying that the post reflects the personal relationship many had to Daly and not to Lorde, as though the impulse to reveal a lie is just a matter of personal loyalties rather than a caring about what is actually true. And it goes on that the post remains here as another negative example and a case study, the lesson of which is a call to renew one's commitments to be willing to hear, see, and feel the cries of those bearing the brunt of injustice, and respond injustice-making actions, as though it is determined in advance that whatever Lorde says is the cries of those bearing the brunt of injustice because she is a black woman and she could not possibly be doing something wrong by lying, by levying accusations of racism on the flimsiest of grounds, and one might even want to say by betraying feminism in the name of anti-racism when it didn't actually need to be an either-or. Okay, second historical case study, Betty Friedan and Bell Hooks. Betty Friedan, author of the 1963 The Feminine Mystique, which we discussed back in Lecture 3, and black feminist Bell Hooks. In her 1984 Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, Hooks had devoted the opening pages to criticism of Friedan. She wrote, "Feminism in the United States has never emerged from the women who are most victimized by sexist oppression. Women who are daily beaten down mentally, physically, and spiritually. Women who are powerless to change their condition in life. They are a silent majority. A mark of their victimization is that they accept their lot in life without visible question, without organized protest, without collective anger or rage." Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is still heralded as having paved the way for contemporary feminist movement. It was written as if these women did not exist. Then a little later, Friedan's famous phrase, "the problem that has no name," often quoted to describe the condition of women in this society, actually referred to the plight of a select group of college-educated, middle and upper-class married white women. Housewives bored with leisure, with the home, with children, with buying products, who wanted more out of life. Friedan concludes her first chapter by stating, "We can no longer ignore that voice within women that says, 'I want something more than my husband and my children and my house.'" That more she defined as careers. She did not discuss who would be called in to take care of the children and maintain the home if more women like herself were freed from their house labor and given equal access with white men to the professions. She did not speak of the needs of women without men, without children, without homes. She ignored the existence of all non-white women and poor white women. She did not tell readers whether it was more fulfilling to be a maid, a babysitter, a factory worker, a clerk, or a prostitute than to be a leisure class housewife. Then again, a little later, specific problems and dilemmas of leisure class white housewives were real concerns that merited consideration and change, but they were not the pressing political concerns of masses of women. And in her 2000 book, Feminism is for Everybody, Hooks wrote, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique identified the problem that has no name as the dissatisfaction females felt about being confined and subordinated in the home as housewives. While this issue was presented as a crisis for women, it really was only a crisis for a small group of well-educated white women. While they were complaining about the dangers of confinement in the home, a huge majority of women in the nation were in the workforce. And many of these working women, who put in long hours for low wages while still doing all the work in the domestic household, would have seen the right to stay home as freedom. Hooks goes on to say that it's not the lack of jobs that kept privileged women from working outside the home, but the fact that the jobs that were available to women were low-paying, unskilled labor jobs, which they didn't want to do. And further, she said that only privileged women had the luxury of imagining that such a job would liberate them and allow economic sufficiency. Working class women already knew from experience that the wages they earned did not liberate them. Friedan, in fact, did talk about these issues. She noted that 1/3 of American women were in work, but that these were generally not young professional women, but rather married women who were widowed and so supporting families, or women supporting their husbands through university. She also said explicitly that work should be meaningful and creative, should allow the woman to make a contribution to something larger than herself. So this would also function as a criticism of the kind of work that many of those women were in fact doing, and that Hooks was emphasizing their doing. Let's just skip back over those paragraphs from Hooks and note the language. For the women in work, a silent majority, masses of women, a huge majority. For the women at home, a select group, not the pressing political concerns of masses of women. Now you might think, charitably, well, they must have had a disagreement about the numbers of women in and out of work. Friedan thought more were in the home and Hooks thought more were in work. If it's an empirical dispute, we can resolve it empirically. And perhaps no one's in the wrong for being wrong. A 2002 paper on changes to the labor force in the United States notes that in 1950, the participation rate of women in the labor force was 34%. This is roughly Friedan's number. The rate rose to 38% in 1960, 43% in 1970, 52% in 1980, 58% in 1990, and was at 60% by the year 2000. This growth was credited to a number of factors, including the women's rights movement, which Friedan was influential in starting. It also included women remaining single more often, women marrying later in life, women choosing to stay in school longer and so getting a better education and better jobs, women having children later, better childcare allowing women to enter the labor force earlier, for example, before waiting for their children to start school, and women getting divorced more often. Data wasn't gathered on the racial composition of the labor markets until 1980, so it's not possible to say what the racial makeup was of the 1/3 of women in work in the 1950s. But Deborah King, in a 1988 paper, has figures from a 1980 book, Black Women in the Labor Force, which shows very similar numbers for Black and white women's participation in the labor force. In 1960, it was 40% Black women and 37% white women, and in 1980, over 50% Black women and 51% white women. So it looks like Friedan was roughly right. At the time she was writing her book, given that it was published in 1963, it will have been around 38% of women in the workforce. But this was actually not a mere empirical dispute, because despite using words like a silent majority, masses of women, a huge majority, Hooks then goes on to agree with Friedan's figure. She writes, when Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, more than 1/3 of all women were in the workforce, meaning more than 2/3 were in the home, meaning Friedan wrote a book about a situation facing most women. So what was the dispute really about? I think it's most plausible that Hooke's criticism was driven by there being material privilege in the position of the suburban housewife, at least from the perspective of those who were not in that position, those who were in work but found it menial and meaningless and would have gladly traded it for more time at home. If we accept that material privilege makes one better off compared to someone with material disadvantage, then the question becomes one about the permissibility of writing a book in feminism that does not focus on the worse off women, even if it articulates a serious problem for a majority of women. This takes us back to MacKinnon's point from Lecture 3 about material versus psychological oppression, and her point that it can be difficult for people to take psychological oppression seriously, especially when they are suffering material oppression. Instead of accepting the priority Hooke gives to the material, we might insist that the material and psychological oppression are on a par. They are things that are differently bad. And we might criticize Hooke for failing to take psychological oppression seriously. Today, Hooke's criticism is taken very seriously, to the point that it is common for the whole second wave to be written off as white feminism, which means the feminism of a very few very privileged women. Yet, once you learn anything about what those women worked for, like establishing the first women's refuges, to give just one example, that criticism becomes obviously absurd. Even if the feminism were done by materially privileged women, it was not done for materially privileged women, and this makes all the difference. From these two historical episodes, we can extract two versions of white feminism. First, a white feminist is someone who chooses not to talk about racism. We take that from the Lorde-Daly dispute. Second, a white feminist is someone who cares equally or more about psychological oppression than material oppression. We take that from the Hooke's-Friedan dispute. Okay, part 2. More on what white feminism might be. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women was published. She argued that women's inferiority was caused by her situation, which is to say, not caused by anything about her that is given in nature. She thought women had been denied the opportunity to develop their faculty of reason, which all people have in equal measure, and they had been denied this because their lives were filled with too much pleasure, which gets in the way. She wrote, "Pleasure is the business of woman's life, according to the present modification of society, and while it continues to be so, little can be expected from such weak beings." But she could not have been talking about all women, because in the Georgian era, 1714 to 1830-ish, there were women working. They worked in organized healthcare, nursing, medicine, pharmacy, surgery, homes for the poor, orphans, pregnant women, and the mentally ill, and as governesses. A 1761 book lists as careers for women basket maker, bodice maker, button maker, cap maker, child's coat maker, fan painter, gilder, quilter, and tassel maker. It is surprisingly difficult to find information about this time that doesn't seem to be about the upper classes, but I asked one of the history lecturers here, and she said that what Wollstonecraft described was a very middle/upper class phenomenon. Most women spent their lives slaving. In addition to ceaseless unpaid domestic labor, women worked in home-based sectors, for example on farms, or by taking in piecework, textiles, caring for other people's children, including wet nursing. Outside their own homes, women were domestic servants, nannies, laundry workers. They were also factory workers, which were just getting going in the Georgian period in a modern sense. So we might from this example extract a third version of white feminism. A white feminist is someone who generalizes from some women to all women. It is especially bad to do this when the women you generalize from are privileged, because it means you miss so much of the serious injustice that the less privileged women may have been experiencing. This mere fact of generalizing may not have any necessary connection to race, meaning one could be a white feminist on this conception who generalized only from the upper classes to the working classes. But in the background might be the claim that white women did exactly this in feminist history, and so missed out the serious injustices unique to women of color, or even not unique to women of color, but worse for women of color. And in this way then, white feminist has become a stand-in for generalizing from some to all, whether the some are demarcated by race or something else. Jumping forward several hundred years, thinking about feminist issues in Hollywood might allow us to extract a fourth version of white feminism. In Hollywood, there is a large sex gap in the number of feature film directors. There is a pay gap between the sexes, and there was recently a lot of publicity for problems of sexual assault and sexual harassment faced by Hollywood actresses. Here, the problem wouldn't be the generalizing from some women to all women, it would be the caring about issues even when you acknowledge that they are the issues only of a small subgroup of women. This version would be something like, a white feminist is a feminist who cares exclusively about privileged women. There's two different ways to understand being privileged though. One is privileged all things considered. She basically has everything going for her, and yet feminism is still catering to her interests rather than to the interests of the worst off women or the interests that all or most women share. This might be an apt criticism of a feminist group, if there is such a group in the world, that chooses Hollywood as its central concern. Although I'm personally inclined to believe in a division of labor and think this would only be bad if there were no other feminist groups working on the many other issues. Another way to understand being privileged, though, is as according to another axis of oppression/disadvantage. Axes are things like race, sex, class, sexual orientation, what other people might call aspects of identity. If we understood privilege in this way, then white feminist might mean middle-class feminist, a feminist concerned with middle-class women's issues, or straight feminist, feminist concerned with straight women's issues. And what complaints about such feminists would express would appear to be that it's bad to not focus on the issues of the more marginalized relative to that axis on which you are privileged. A middle-class woman should focus on working-class women's issues. A straight woman should focus on lesbian women's issues. But once you say it like that, it sounds far less obviously true, not least because the imperative of identity politics was to fight for what you are and what you know. Let's now turn to Catharine MacKinnon's 1991 paper, From Practice to Theory, or What is a White Woman Anyway?, which is helpful in trying to work out what is behind complaints about white women and white feminism. In the first part of her paper, MacKinnon is concerned to advance an understanding of what it is to be treated as a woman, and to explain how women who are also oppressed according to other features of identity, like race, can nonetheless at least sometimes be oppressed as women. Then in the second part of the paper, she turns to white women specifically. About what it is to be treated as a woman, she says, to speak of being treated as a woman is to make an empirical statement about reality, to describe the realities of women's situation. In this country, with parallels in other cultures, women's situation combines unequal pay with allocation to disrespected work, sexual targeting for rape, domestic battering, sexual abuse as children, and systemic sexual harassment, depersonalization, demeaned physical characteristics, use in denigrating entertainment, deprivation of reproductive control, and forced prostitution. These are practices done to women by men, and they help to form the system of sex hierarchy that feminists are concerned with. Women as a group have a collective social history in which they have been and continue to be disempowered, exploited, and subordinated. So, she says, to be treated as a woman in this sense is to be disadvantaged in these ways, incident to being socially assigned to the female sex. But there emerged in the course of feminist theory a challenge to identifying and criticizing practices of women's subordination as women. And that challenge came to the idea of treatment as a woman itself. Some said there was no such thing as woman, just more specific combinations of identities. Some thought there was woman, but nonetheless, we should always theorize her oppression together with other identities that she has, or that most women have. MacKinnon says it came to her attention that the problem really was white women. So, she says, I decided I better find out what one is. She writes of white woman, this creature is not poor, not battered, not raped, not really, not molested as a child, not pregnant as a teenager, not prostituted, not coerced into pornography, not a welfare mother, and not economically exploited. She doesn't work. She is either the white man's image of her, effete, pampered, privileged, protected, flighty, and self-indulgent, or the black man's image of her. All that plus the pretty white girl, meaning ugly as sin, but regarded as the ultimate in beauty because she is white. She flings her hair, feels beautiful all the time, complains about the colored help, tips badly, can't do anything, doesn't know anything, and alternates fantasizing about fucking black men with accusing them of raping her. On top of all this, out of impudence, imitativeness, pique, and a simple lack of anything meaningful to do, she thinks she needs to be liberated. This is a view of woman modified, as MacKinnon puts it. Woman discounted by white, meaning she would be oppressed but for her privilege. But, MacKinnon says, this image seldom comes face to face with the rest of her reality. And she goes on to describe another picture of white women. She says, the fact that the majority of the poor are white women and their children, at least half of whom are female, that white women are systematically battered in their homes, murdered by intimates and serial killers alike, molested as children, actually raped, mostly by white men, and that even black men on average make more than they do. If one did not know this, one could be taken in by white men's image of white women, that the pedestal is real rather than a cage in which to confine and trivialize them and segregate them from the rest of life. A vehicle for sexualized infantilization, a virginal setup for rape by men who enjoy violating the pure, and a myth with which to try to control black women. And she goes on to clarify that this doesn't mean we have to deny what she calls skin privilege. It just means that their skin has never insulated white women from the brutality and misogyny of men, mostly but not exclusively white men, or from its effective legalization. In other words, the white girls of this theory miss quite a lot of the reality of white women in the practice of male supremacy. MacKinnon's diagnosis of the contemptuous treatment of white women is that it reveals that speakers actually don't believe in the oppression of women as women. If white women are not oppressed, then there's no such thing as treatment as a woman. There's no theory of sex discrimination to be the legal theory of that practice. No theory of identifying and criticizing practices of women's subordination that relates to the practice of women's liberation as women. But that is just not true, because there is such a thing as being treated as a woman, being oppressed as a woman, a thing that applies to all women, including white women. Women of color have that and more. Women with disabilities have that and more. MacKinnon says, what is done to white women can be done to any woman and then some. This does not make white woman the essence of womanhood. It is a reality to observe that this is what can be done and is done to the most privileged of women. This is what privilege as a woman gets you, most valued as dead meat. She also makes the interesting suggestion that the dismissal of white women may reveal that oppression is taken more seriously in a form that is also done to a man. The white woman, privileged in all respects but her sex, doesn't share her oppression with any man, so her oppression is not taken seriously. MacKinnon says how the white woman is imagined and constructed and treated becomes a particularly sensitive indicator of the degree to which women, as such, are despised. We might state this as a fifth version of white feminism. A white feminist is someone who believes there is such a thing as women's oppression, and that even white women, even wealthy women, even straight women, and so on, face it. But again, when stated so plainly, it's far from obvious that it's a position that deserves the antipathy that it gets. Okay, part 3. In this final brief part of the lecture, I want to consider a sixth version of white feminism, which is perhaps a cousin of the version we took from the Lorde-Daly dispute. I'll state it as: a white feminist is a feminist who is not intersectional. This relates to Lorde's point in that intersectional approaches to feminism are designed to acknowledge and emphasize the differences between women, race being one of them. And of course, because intersectional feminism came from Black women thinkers, starting with Anna Julia Cooper in 1892 and developing through Frances Beale, the Combahee River Collective, Deborah King, and others, before its best-known version was advanced by Kimberly Crenshaw. From its inception, Black feminism focused on the intersection of Blackness and womanness, although different thinkers also brought in other axes, like sexual orientation or nationality. This way of stating white feminism also brings in the idea from some of the other versions that white feminism has something to do with privilege, but in this version it is read not as all things considered privilege or material privilege, but as having fewer axes on which you fall on the disadvantaged rather than the advantaged end. Meaning, for example, if you think about your sex, race, and class and find yourself female, white, and wealthy, or male, black, and wealthy, or male, white, and poor, then you are considered as privileged compared to someone who falls on the disadvantaged end for 2 out of 3. And especially compared to someone who falls on the disadvantaged end for 3 out of 3. Now, it is worth noting that empirically, this, what we might call logic of intersectional privilege, as I have presented it, does not stack up in light of recent empirical work showing that for a range of outcomes, including social mobility, in America, the worst off group is Black men, not Black women. But we can still consider it either as a theoretically interesting but empirically wrong theory, or as a potentially empirically correct theory if you weight all the axes differently to engineer an explanation of why Black women are doing better than Black men. Maybe the axes interact in some complicated way where sex or class reduce or enhance the effects of race differently depending on sex. Kate Phelan and I had a paper published in 2022 in which we tried to disambiguate all the versions of intersectionality that we'd come across so that we could state the claim that feminism had better be intersectional precisely and thereby be able to assess whether it was true. Here's a slightly simplified list of the 6 versions of the claim we identified. In terms of experience, there is something that it feels like to be oppressed in more than one way. In terms of knowledge, those oppressed in more ways have more or better knowledge than those oppressed in fewer ways. In terms of law, there are gaps in the law that mean people facing multiple oppressions lack anti-discrimination protection. In terms of explanation, understanding multiple oppressions offers a better explanation of human behavior than understanding a single oppression. In terms of ethics, there is one problem of injustice with many symptoms. An intersectional approach is more likely to solve that one problem, so we should take an intersectional approach. And finally, in terms of metaphysics, because the major systems of oppression are interlocking and produce oppression that is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, here quoting from Combahee and from Crenshaw, we must consider more than the single systems of oppression. Okay, and here's our translation of each version of the intersectionality claim into an imperative that feminism be intersectional. Translation of the experience version: feminism must pay attention to what it's like to be oppressed by sex plus at least one other identity feature. Translation of the knowledge version: feminism must make use of the unique perspective, beliefs, or knowledge of particular people gained through their particular lived experience of women oppressed by sex plus at least one other identity feature. Translation of the law version: feminism must work for legal protection against discrimination for sex plus at least one other identity feature in combination, rather than for sex alone. Translation of the explanation version: feminism must seek explanations of women's oppression that draw on more than sex alone. Translation of the ethics version: feminist activism must be focused on the intersectional categories at the root of all oppression rather than on the single category of sex. And final translation of the Metaphysics version: feminism must focus on the mitigation of novel forms of intersectional oppression, always including sex, but never only sex, which are more than the sum of their parts. Our conclusion in the paper was that once precisely stated, none of these imperatives for feminism appeared obviously true. The experience claim goes through only if feminism as a project relies on testimony about what oppression is like, which might have been true of the consciousness-raising projects of the second wave, but might no longer be needed. The knowledge claim stands or falls with standpoint theory, because if there is no such unique perspective, then it cannot be true that feminism must make use of it. Of all the people invoking the idea of intersectionality and naming Crenshaw, most are not making the narrow legal claim that she actually advances, but rather are going well beyond it. The explanation claim depends on whether women's oppression is really explained by more than sex alone, rather than, for example, Black women's total oppression being explained by the two systems, racism and sexism, but Black women's oppression as women being explained by sexism, and Black women's oppression as Black being explained by racism. The ethical claim stands or falls with the claim that there is one grand source of all oppression, a claim that was not itself particularly well evidenced when made. And the metaphysical claim depends not only on whether there are any such novel forms of intersectional oppression that are not a mere coming together of racism, sexism, and classism. And even if there are, we might wonder why the upshot is that feminism, conceived as about the subordination of women as women, must be intersectional, rather than that there ought to also be an intersectional justice theory and movement. Nothing in the claims of intersectional theorists, to our mind, demonstrated the impermissibility of a theory and movement focused on a single system of oppression. Okay, so here for your reference are the 6 versions of white feminism. Let me know in the comments which you think is the best fit for the mainstream feeling against white feminism, and whether you think it would be particularly wrong to take that view of feminism, and if so, why?